Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is YOMA Memches. We begin on the bottom of Mem Zayin Amud Beis. And the Gemara today will present some shilos regarding Kmitzas HaMincha throughout the year and Chafinas Keteres on Yom Kippur. Begins the Gemara at the last word of the Amud, Boy. Boy Rav Papa presented as follows. He had a shiloh. We know Kmitzas HaMincha entails scooping out a handful of that mincha batter contained in the kli. And then he takes the kmitza and he transports it into another kli, an empty kli sharetz, which is now going to be mekadesh that kmitza portion and enable it for haktar. Boy Rav Papa asked as follows: Dav ke lekoimetz. What if he decided to stick this glob of batter of kmitza b'doifnei demona onto the wall, onto the inside wall of a kli? What is the halacha? So rather than taking the kmitza and placing it onto the bottom of the kli shoretz where it really belongs, he decided to stick it into the wall, inside the kli, but on the wall of the kli. Is that going to be mekadesh the koimetz? What's the shaila? It's inside, but not resting on the bottom of a kli, which is generally how you use a kli. Toich kli ba'inan va'ika. Is the interior of the kli needed? In which case we have it. It's called the aver kli. It's inside a kli. It's contained inside a kli, and therefore it becomes niskadish. Or perhaps hanocha b'soichai ketikna ba'inan va'leka. Or perhaps that's not enough. It has to actually rest on the bottom of the kli, the way it's meant to be. V'alek, in this case you don't have it, and perhaps it does not work, it will not become kaddish in that kli. Teiku, we leave it unresolved. Now, the halacha is that when it comes to kabbalas hadam, you see the avodas of mincha, the four avodas of the mincha, kmitza, matan bekli, which means taking that kmitza and putting it into an empty kli sharetz, which is kaddish the kmitza and enables it for haktarah. And then we have the halacha transporting the kometz in the kli over to the mizbeach and the haktarah itself on the mizbeach. Those four phases of avodah by a mincha correspond to the four stages of avodah by a carbon, by a behema. We have the shchita, we have the kabbalas hadam and a kli, and we have the halacha walking into the mizbeach and the zrika. By a mincha, instead we have kmitza, which is a form of separating. You're separating the kmitza portion from the rest, from the shirayim, which is similar to shchita, which is meant to separate the dam from the carbon. Then we have the placement of the komet into the second kli. That's like kabbalas hadam. We have the halacha, which we have by both. We have the aktoras hakometz, which corresponds to the zrikas hadam. Now the Gemara in Zvachim tells us very clearly that when it comes to kabbalas hadam by a behema, even the avir of a kli, the airspace of a kli, is considered. You've accomplished kabbalah as long as the dam, as soon as the dam is contained within the airspace of the kli, you don't need to have the dam rest on the bottom. So why would the Gemara question whether or not this works by a kmitza, by a mincha? Now Farshim explained, because by dam, you don't need to actually place the dam into the kli. It's just happening. It's flowing in from the animal to the kli. As long as the kli acquires it, as long as it's within the airspace of the kli, it's contained within the avar of the kli, that's enough to accomplish kabbalah. That's by kabbalas hadam, which doesn't need any sinas hadam in the kli. You're not manually doing it. It's just happening. It's flowing in. As long as it arrived into the kli in somewhat fashion, that's enough. However, when it comes to mincha, perhaps that's Rav Papa's shaila. Avar is not enough. Because, think about it, here it's not happening. He's doing it. It's a masa nesina b'kli. And perhaps for that to really work and happen, you have to use the kli properly. You have to place it into the kli. Just hanging it on the wall is not really called utilizing the kli as you meant to. It's just a vertical wall. It could have been just a plain wall for all you care. It's not really using the kli. That only happens if he actually has it rest on the bottom of the kli, which is the proper way of using a kli. So perhaps only then will he have accomplished this form of Kabbalah, this form of Nesinas Bakli, which is Mekadesh, the Mincha, the Kmitza. Take it, we leave it unresolved. Says the Gemara further, Boye Maravashi. Let's take it a step further. Avche lemana, v'davke lekoimetz, bari'ise demana ma'u. Suppose you have to actually place the mincha on the bottom surface of the kli. Okay, let's take that as a given, as a fact. What if he was avche lemana? He took the kli and overturned it. V'davke lekoimetz, and he stuck the koimetz bari'ise demana. Now, Rashi seems to learn that we're speaking about a kli that had a bottom. Sometimes you have these bechers that have the bottoms, and the bottom isn't just a flat bottom, but it's actually an overturned kli. So now if you tip the whole kli upside down, the base will now be facing upward. He took the kaimet and placed it on that surface. So it's a masa hanacha, it's not just hanging in the air, but it's in the wrong place of the kli. It's not really properly using the kli. That's not how you properly use the kli. That's one pshat. The Rashash learns a bit differently. He says, Avchi lemana, he tipped over the kli, and v'davke, the kaimetz bar isei demana mao means he stuck the kaimetz onto the surface, the bottom surface of the kli, which is now overturned. So yeah, it was the bottom of the kli, the inside, the bottom, but it's overturned, it's upside down. Is that considered or not? Avchi lemana, he turned over the kli, v'davke the kaimetz, and he embedded the kaimetz bar isei demana onto the floor of the kli, onto the bottom. So he had it rest on the bottom, but it's just not the way you use a kli. Ma, what is Allah? Hanacha b'seicha b'inan v'ha'ika. Do we need a hanacha onto the bottom of the kli, in which case you have it? Or perhaps it needs to be a proper hanacha. You have to use it properly. Using it upside down, inside out, that doesn't work. Take it and leave it as a shaila. So we have two shailas. Number one, embedding it along the side of the kli. And number two, onto the bottom surface, but overturned, and we leave it as take. Boy Rav Papa, I have a shaila regarding Yom Kippur. The Maloicha Fnai. Scooping out that terrace on Yom Kippur. This handful, is it going to be exact, flat surface? So he fills his hand and has a flat surface on top, no overfill. The Maloicha Fnai that we described, are they going to be flat? Mechika is like erased. It's going to be erased straight on top. Nothing above his hands. An exact handful. Or Gedusha, so perhaps it's going to have overfill. It's going to be piled up high. The way you fill your hands generously. Which way is it? Now, the Farshim point out the fact that we had a Shavi yesterday. Malay. We compared Chafinas Kteres to Kmitzas Mincha. So just as by Kmitza, we find that it has to be within the Kaimetz. Bikumtzai. Perhaps here as well we should need the same, and the answer is no, because although we perhaps do compare the two things, Chafina to Kmitza, but the fact is that the Torah does say Maloi Chafnav, describing it a bit differently than Kaimetz, which is Bikumtzai, within his hand, strictly within the Kmitza, nothing sticking out. Here we have a term Maloi Chafnav, which denotes generosity, a bit more than just the handful itself. So that's the Gemara's shayla. Mechukos or Kedushos, exact or overflowing. Amalei Rabbi Abba, Rav Ashi. Rav Abba tells Rav Ashi like this: Tashma, listen to my right. The Brisa says Maloi Chafnav she'amru. The Maloi Chafnav that we speak about, Loi Mechukos. It's not meant to be exact. Maloi Kedushos, nor overflowing. Ela Tfufos. Tfufos, Rashi says, means a bit floating. Means not too much overfill, but just a bit topped off the top. So, as the Farshim explain, we assume that's the way a person cups his hands and fills them. If you want to take a good handful and fill your hands, inevitably you're going to have a little bit topping off on top, so not this high-rise overfill, nor is it going to be straight and flat, but just a bit more than what's contained within the airspace. That conforms to the pasuk's description of Malay Chafnaf. Continues the Gemara with another shayla. Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah in Zvachim. So we're speaking about a carbon of Amig Behema. After the Shechita, the Kohen arrives with the Kli, and is Makabel that dam, the dam HaNefesh, which flows out in a hurry from the animal. He does Kabbalah, and then proceeds to Lachanzrik. Nishbach Adam ala Ritzvah. Suppose the dam flowed out from the neck onto the floor, and he decided to retrieve the dam v'asafai. He gathered it together into a kli pasla. It's no longer fit for zrika. Lost his chance. He meant to be makabel directly from the animal. It's a direct, continuous process. You can't have anything in between. If it dropped on the floor, it terminated the procedure, in which case it's no longer roi for zrika. But says a different Mishnah there in Zvachim, minakli ala ritzba. Suppose he was ready makabel adam directly into a kli, and then it got spilled over. Minakli ala ritzba v'asafai, and he gathered it back together into a kli kosher. Now it's roi for zrika. Why? Because he was makabel it properly. It went straight from the animal to the kli, in which case it arrived at its destination. It was in the Scottish in the kli. It became enabled for zrika. So now, once it achieved that status, it can no longer lose it. Even after it gets spilled, you can go ahead and gather it back into the kli. But now, immediately, how do we know this concept? Which concept? That the dam has to flow directly from the tzavar of the behemah into the kli. It's not a rabbanon, v'lokach midam hapar. We learn from here, it has to be midam hapar. It has to contain the nefesh of the par. Midam ha-nefesh. The first initial flow, the gush of dam, which contains the nefesh of the animal. V'lo midam ha-ar. Rather than the blood embedded in the hide of the animal. V'lo midam ha-tamtis. Or blood which trickles out of the ivarim of the animal. That's number one. It has to be dam ha-nefesh. What else do we learn? From midam ha-par we learn dam mei ha-par yikableno. The Kabbalah needs to take place directly. Dam from the par without any intermediaries, without any hafsaka. And that's also what we learn from the words midam hapar, as the Gemara will explain. Because if you just view the pasuk literally, midam hapar, just a portion of the dam of the par, that's fine. You don't need to take more than that. Even lichatchil, just a little bit is enough. He's like a daitach. Midam apar means midam vafilu miktas dam. Even just a small portion of the dam is sufficient. There's no need to trouble yourself and take more than that, even lechatchila. That's not the case. V'amar Rabbi Yehuda hamakabel tzarich sheikabel es kol dam mishal par. Lechatchila, one is meant to be makabel the entire dam hanefesh of the par. Shenemar ves kol hadam dam apar yishbech l'yisayim mizbeach. So Chatchili meant to do the entire dam nefesh. So that leads us to assume that we're not meant to learn the pasuk literally. V'lokach mi, a small portion of the dam apar. Rather, we apply a drush. No. Apparently, the proper way to learn the pasuk is through a drush. My midam apar. What does the pasuk mean? Midam apar. We take away the mem from midam. We attach it to the next word hapar. And it reads dam mei hapari kablenu. How is he meant to be makabel dam directly from the par? Because Savar, and he holds gurin, we cut away. Umeisif, and then we add on. So we take the mem from the first word, we add it on to the next word. V'darshan, and we apply a drasha. Now the pasuk reads v'lokach dam mei hapar. It needs to be direct masa kabbalah from the par, without falling on the floor first. So that's regarding a carbon behem, a zevach. He does a shchita, and then is makabel directly from the par. Should it spill out? Well, it depends. Depends at what point it happened. If he was already makabel l'dam, in which case it was already in the Scottish bikli and enabled for azrika, then you're okay. You're safe to go. Even if a spill took place, just gather it back together and put it into the kli. It doesn't lose its status. However, if before he even got a chance to be makabel, that dam flowed right out on the floor, it's too late. Because he no longer has the opportunity to make a direct Kabbalah from the Parnakli. Okay, so how does that apply to us here by Chafina? Boy Rav Papa, once again, Rav Papa presents a shayla. What happens by Chafina's K'teris? So he has the Machta in front of him. He approaches the Machta with his two hands, scoops up the K'teris, and then the K'teris slips out, ends up on the floor. Nispazer K'teris b'maloi chafnav mal. What if the K'teris slips out of his hands, ends up on the floor? Can he go ahead and scoop it back together? Or it becomes puzzle. What are the two sides of the coin here? Yodei kitzaver behema dami, upsula. Should we view the hands of the coin like the neck of the animal? In which case, if it drops out of the tzaver, and in this case the keter is out of his hands, it's no longer right, it's puzzle. Why? Why should we assume that his hands have a din of a tzaver? Because, think of it this way. Technically speaking, do we need a kli by Chafinas K'teris? No. The Gemara yesterday explained to us that it's only out of practical considerations that we insert a ladle into the equation. Otherwise, there's no practical way of transporting and maneuvering the K'teris and the Chalam all the way into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the kli, the ladle, the spoon, is inserted simply for convenience. Technically, halachically, you don't need a kli. And the Gemara assumes that perhaps you'll say that the hands of the kohen are already considered final destination as far as the K'teris is concerned. The hands could be considered like a kli. The hands of the kohen enable the K'teris Faktorah. In which case, once you've arrived at that point, that's the final destination. You have Kedushas K'teris. It's become enabled Faktorah. Now, if it spills out, it's okay. Retrieve it, put it back in your hands. Or, the other side is, no. At the end of the day, you need a ladle. Be it for practical considerations. But Lamaisa, a kli is going to be involved. And the Chafina is merely a way to, it's just a first step. He does Chafina, but afterwards has to transport the content into a kli. So it's en route to the kli. It hadn't really achieved its final status, hadn't arrived at final destination. And therefore, says the Gemara, perhaps, if it drops down at this point, since it's en route, it's in the middle of the process, which hasn't yet been completed, it becomes possible. So those are the two sides of the coin. Once again, Rav Papa Chishe, Nespazer Akteris, what happens if the K'teris disperses out of his hands? Well, what is the Allah? Yodei Ketzaver Behema Dami, Upsula. Should we say, well, there's going to be a kli involved. He's on his way to the kli, and until he arrives at that point, at that destination, the process of the K'teris hadn't been completed yet. Had not been really enabled for Haktorah. And therefore we compare the Kohen's hands to the Tzavar Behema, which is another way of saying that it's en route, it's mid-process, and if it falls down, it's possible. Upsula. Or perhaps shall we say Kiklisharistam? Since technically you don't really need a kli at all. You just have a kli for practical convenience considerations. So perhaps the Yadayim of the Kohen, the Chafin of the Kohen, can be considered like a kli sharis. Technically, the Chafin itself enables the K'teris for Haktorah purposes. It has technically arrived at its final destination, which enables it for Haktorah. So perhaps since the process has already been successfully completed, we don't care if it spills out. Just retrieve it back, put it back in your hands. Take it, we leave it as a shot. Furthermore, Boy Rav Papa, We know that if a kohen has a machshava, I'm going to eat this carbon in a week's time. So he's sheikh the carbon, or does Kabbalah, or Hilacha, or Zrika, any one of those four primary avodas, with a machshava of pigel. I'm doing this with a mindset, with an intent to do the Zrika, or the Achila, past the expiry date. That becomes pigel. The shaila is regarding the Ma'asachafinas K'teris. Mao. What is the halacha here? If he was machashev machshavas pigel, does it take effect? Does it invalidate the K'teris? Does it become pasul? Does it become pigel? Mi amrinon yolef miloi mincha. Shall we apply that dirishava? By K'teris it says miloi. By mincha it says miloi. We should say, well, let's equate the two things. Ma also mahanya b'machshava, just as over there by a mincha, machshava certainly is effective and passes the mincha. Hachanami here as well, mahanya b'machshava. Machshava will affect the K'teris. Oiloi, or perhaps we don't equate the two things. Now, what would be the svara to say that machshavas pigel doesn't apply in this case? So the Nefarshim explain, based on the words of Rashi, perhaps the concept of pigel can only apply when we're speaking about a carbon, something which attained kedushas haguf, such as a mincha. Once inserted into that kli sharis, it rose higher. It acquired kedushas haguf. It's now been enabled for akrava l'mizbech. That's what kedushas haguf means. It's inherently kaddish. It's prepared for akrava. It left the lower level of kedushas damim, which is only a monetary kedusha for its value, and it rose up to kedushas haguf, which means it's oimed for akrovas mizbech. So certainly pigel applies to a mincha because it has kedushas haguf. It's a carbon. A machshava during the avoid of that carbon affects the carbon. But perhaps K'teris is in a different category. Why? Because although K'teris, just as much as mincha, happens to be an iklicharis, we have a machta, we have a kaf. But once again, the kli isn't really a necessary component. It's not really a critical part of the procedure. Technically, you don't even need a kli. Just scoop it out and walk into Pesach Kedusha. Out of practical considerations, we bring a kli into the picture. That's how the ladle comes into the picture. But really, you don't need a kli to enable this K'teris factor. So once again, although technically it was put into a kli sharis, but perhaps that kli sharis, it will not affect the kedusha of the K'teris, will not upgrade it to make it into kedushas haguf. Why? Because he doesn't need a kli. The kli only functions and is effective when needed. If the kli plays a role in the hakrava process, such as by mincha, you need a kli to enable the mincha of hakrava, then the kli turns it into kedushas haguf. It changes the status of its content from kedushas damim. It's now in a kli sharis, awaiting hakrava for the mizbech, because really that's what kli sharis means. It's a service kli for the mizbech. It turns its content into a carbon. But when a kli isn't really part of the process, a Torah does not mandate, does not require a kli when it comes to chavinas k'teris. Perhaps the kli won't upgrade the k'teris and turn it into kedushas haguf, in which case you can't have machshava, akrava, pigel. These things don't apply if it's not kedushas haguf. So on the one hand we say, let's equate it to mincha, and let's say that machshava works throughout the process, just like by mincha. Or perhaps no, it doesn't have the same madrei of kedusha, and machshava won't work. Amalei Rav Simi bar Ashi Rav Papa. Rav Simi Rashi tells Rav Papa, I have a raya, the machshava's pigel will work by chafin. Toshma. The halacha is like this. Hoyisiv Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva added to what? In the beginning of the halacha we have that when there was Efer Paraduma sitting in a kli, and a portion of it was touched by a tummy, we say the entire content becomes tummy. Although it's a large amount of content, well, this is a maila by kachon, we say the kli is mitzaref. Anything within the kli is deemed as one entity. So even if the tummy touches just a small portion, everything The tumah extends throughout the kli. Everything in that kli is considered one entity and becomes possible. Rabbi Akiva added another couple of examples. Hoyser Rabbi Akiva, hakoymet v'akteris. Okay, that's what we have to keep in mind. V'akteris. V'alavoyna v'agechol. Shimnaga tful yom mektsasan. If you don't have tful yom, who's experiencing a very weak level of tumah, he's already been toivel, he's just a shein of tumah, and could be mitami things which are kadosh kedusha sakov. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. If the tful yom should come into contact with even just a small portion of these coals, of this teres, whatever it is that's sitting in the kli, pasla is cool and everything becomes pas. End quote. Okay, how does this apply to us? We see clearly that the ketores, we're assuming that it's even ketores on Yom Kippur, used for the Kodesh HaKadoshim, on which he performs this chafina procedure, will be included in this halach. That it can become possible through a tful yom, which is unique to something which is Kodesh Kedushas Hakuf. Apparently, ketores is considered Kodesh Kedushas Hakuf. The bottom line is, it's put into a kli. The kli is makadosh it. The Gemara figures, the Gemara draws analogy that midah pasa al tful yom, just as tful yom, invalidates it because it's considered Kedushas Hakuf through that kli. Pasla nami lina. Likewise, the psulina can apply. It's left overnight, it becomes pasla. Because tful yom, lina, synonymous with each other, they both apply to things which have that added measure of kedusha sakuf. Because they're left over beyond the yom avodah, becomes pasla. Umidalina pasla, concludes the Gemara. The fact that lina works, if you actually leave the ketores overnight, it becomes pasla. Pasla nami machshava. Likewise, a machshava, a pigel. If you had in mind, during the chafina, I'm going to be marked to this in a week's time, it makes a pasla, it makes a pigel. So that's the conclusion of the Gemara. The fact that you use a kli in the process, that adds kedusha sakuf to the ketores, in which case it now becomes highly sensitive and susceptible to all types of psulam and tumas, tful yom, lina, and machshavas pigel as well. That's Rashi's approach. Taisus has another twist to the Gemara's back and forth. What was the Gemara's shaila? Chishe bechafinas teres mao. Can a machshava affect? Can it affect the chafina of ketores? Says Taisus, why would I think not? Why would chafinas ketores be different than the kmitza done by a mincha, which certainly carries with it a machshava's pigel potential? So this is a big difference between two things. As I mentioned earlier, the Gemara in Zvachim speaks about the fact that the four avodas by a mincha correspond to the four avodas by a karvan, by a behem. So you have the kmitza, which is a separating act, which corresponds to the shechita, which separates the dam from the rest of the animal and prepares it for akram. And we have the Nasina Bakli, which is like the Kabbalah, the Halach, and the Zrik. Of course, as Taisus, Machshava works by Kmitza. It's like Shechita. It's an act of separation. But Chafinas Ketores, says Taisus, what does it have to do with Kmitza? He has a kli filled with Ketores, and he scoops out a Chafina. He's not coming to separate. In fact, says Taisus, even the leftover Ketores can be used next year, or whatever it is. It's not... It's chel gavoyim. I'm sure we could use next year, but it's not considered shirayim. It's roy like Torah, which is very different than a kaimitz, where once he makes that separation, he does the kmitza, the rest is shirayim, as we learned yesterday. We had a whole sugi about that. We have a kaimitz, the rest is shirayim. It's been downgraded to leftovers. Here you're not doing that. You're not creating that separation. You're not designating this for karban, this for shirayim. Therefore, perhaps you cannot compare it. It's dissimilar to kmitza or to shechita, in which case it does not have a din of an avoida to the extent that a machshava during the chafina can affect the karban. The Gemara concludes, yes. The fact is, we see that all these other psulim, tful yom and lina work. Apparently, this ketores, since it was contained in a kli sharis, which is mekadosh tekturis, and grants it that additional measure of kedusha saguf. What does that tell you about what's happening here? Evidently, there's a hakrova taking place. There are avodas taking place as a result of it being placed in the klisharis. The klisharis enables it for avodah. That's the point of klisharis, a kli of service, of serving the mizbeach, facilitating avodah and hakrova. Therefore, the Gemara concludes, even the Masach Hafina has chashivas and is considered like an avodah like any other, like mitzvah, like shchita, in which case a machshavas psul that transpired during that chafina will make it possible. That's his approach to the sukkah. Continues the Gemara with another shaila presented by Rapapa. Chishev v'chasiyas gecholamal. Now that we concluded that machshava will be effective to the detriment of the Kteris, if that machshava took place during the chafinas Kteris, what about a machshava during chasiyas gecholam? Remember, he went up to the mizbeach, took a shovel, scooped around those coals. Is that considered like an avodah? And if he had a machshava pigel, machshava psul during that procedure, does it affect the carbon? Does the Kteris now become possible? Chishev b'chasiyas gecholam. Why should we say it's an avodah? It's just scooping up some coals. It's not the Kteris, it's not the carbon. The shaila is machshir mitzvah ki mitzvah damu. Shall we say that the enabler of a mitzvah is considered like the mitzvah? Coals are considered part of the package here. The coals facilitate the aktaris keturis, which is placed on the coals, and therefore we say it's part and parcel of the keturis. And the machshava by the chasiyas gecholim will affect everything, or perhaps not. We separate between gecholim, which are only considered machshir carbon, enablers of the carbon, and not the carbon itself, and therefore machshava doesn't work. Take it, we leave it unresolved. And Tezes has a lashon here. Let's just see the Rashi first. Up on top, chishe b'chasiyas gecholim, mau lahavsel hakteris. Should we say that the teres becomes possible? K'mitzvah dami. V'havale k'machashiv avodah. Should we say it's like a mitzvah, meaning it's like the avodah itself, in which case a machshava works. Lashon ach. Another slightly different lashon of Rashi is chishev b'chasiyas gecholam mau sheyivsu gecholim b'machshava zu m'lakta aleim. Rashi's second lashon was that the Gemara presented a shadow regarding the gecholim themselves. She had a machshava during scooping up those coals. Should we say the gecholim become possible? Apparently, according to this lashon, certainly it won't affect the kteris. The shadows does even affect the gecholim. And Rashi continues, Lina, when it comes to psulina, of course, that applies to gecholim. Shamina, the pasul of behul, of course it applies to the gecholim, but the pasul of tulyaim, just as tulyaim works, because it's not le'el, as we had a mishnah before, that gecholim was listed on that list of things which have kedusha guf and can become nifsal through lina and tulya. That's pashut. Miu hamiboilan. But the Gemara wants to know regarding the machshavas psul. Miboilan, you have a chasiyos and avoida. Should we consider an avoida l'mifsal b'machshava? The machshava takes place during the chatiyah, during the scooping act. Is that considered a machshavas psul? The Gemara asks whether machshir mitzvah ki mitzvah damu v'chiyechet machshavas chafina pasel b'kteris machshavas chasiyah nami pasel b'gecholim. Should we say just as machshavas chafina, we just concluded earlier, the machshava during the chafina works to pasel the kteris huadin, the machshava during the chasiyas gecholim will have the same effect on the gecholim. The Gemara leaves it teku. Interesting. Taisus adds a lashon. What should be the tzad to say that the machshava during the chasiyas gecholim will be paisel? So he says, machshir mitzvah ki mitzvah damu v'chafina arichtei. He says the chafina of the gecholim is considered like one continuous masa chafina together with the kteris, because they relate to each other. It's one bundle, one package. V'havi chasiyas gecholim v'chafina b'mokim kmitza. That's one side. Or no, perhaps we separate between chasiyas, keteris, which involves the actual carbon material, and in which case it's considered an avoid, as opposed to the chasiyas gecholim, which are just machshir mitzvah, not considered integral part of the carbon here, and therefore a machshava will not affect it. The concept of Psul Machshava only applies to Ma'asa Avoda, Ma'asa Krova, concerning the actual korban, the actual Keteris, the actual Mincha, but not Gechal. And we leave it take. Bo Minim Rav Sheshes. The Bnei Yeshiva asked Rav Sheshes the following Shaila. This is unrelated to Yom Kippur. This is throughout the year. Halacha b'Smoil Mao. What happens if the Kohen chooses to walk the Kli with a dam over to the Mizbeach, all the while holding the Kli in his left hand? Well, what is the halacha? Let's go over to Rashi, right to the left. Halacha b'Smoil Mao. Halacha hadami boil. The question is regarding halacha. Explains Rashi, why is the Shaila Dafka focused on halacha? Kabbalah Uzrika. However, when it comes to Kabbalah, Uzrika, it's pretty clear. The Chsibu Kuhuna. The Torah mentions the word Kohen during those things. Pshitalon dechol makam shenemar etzba kuhuna ein elimin. It's certainly clear that whenever the Torah makes a reference to etzba of the Ovid or Kohen, the Gemara in Zvachim learns this, that it's certainly referring to Yemin. You need a right hand. And therefore, Zrika or Kabbalah is no Shaila. You need a Kohen. Like Sibed. But when it comes to halacha, the Torah doesn't even express halacha clearly. It's not clearly stated in the Psukim. How do we even know the concept of halacha? It's one of the four avodas. How do we know that? We learn it from a riboy, from a drasha. When the Torah speaks about Kabbalah, Pasuk says Vikrivu. Vikrivu has a halacha ring to it. Vikrivu, bring closer. The fact that the Torah expresses the Kabbalah, the Masa Kabbalah, using halacha terminology. The Sani Vikrivu, Zu Kabbalah Sadam. Vikrivu means Kabbalah Sadam. Why Vikrivu? The Torah is being marba that you're meant to do halacha as well. Nafkal, that's where we learn halacha. Misachas Chaki. Sheyavoid. Umilu Smoil. But when it comes to right or left, since it's not a clear-cut pasuk, there certainly is no reference to the word kohen or etzba when it comes to halacha. It's just inferred from the pasuk of Kabbalah. There's room to speculate and say the le pasuk Smoil would not invalidate it. The haloi kosim, but couldn't be. We don't have kahuna clearly stated by halacha. That's the Gemara's shayla. We know that Kabbalah and Zrika need Yemin. But what about halacha? Since halacha is just learned through a riboy within the pasuk of Kabbalah, so perhaps halacha is different and Smoil is okay. Asks Taisus, what do you mean? What's the hava mean? A tema. If you learn halacha from Kabbalah, of course, it has the same halacha as Kabbalah. Kabbalah has to be Yemin, of course, halacha as well. It's more Shaila. The Yishlema says Taisus. The Gemara did have a tzad, a svara to say that Smoil will be kosher by halacha. Why? Because by Yom Kippur we find that Smoil is fine when it comes to halacha. Where? Yesterday's that. King Gadol is going to walk into Kodesh Kadashim holding the mach in his right and the kaf with the Keteris in his left. So you find a precedent to this concept of Smoil being employed by halacha. That was the Gemara Shaila. Should we say that halacha perhaps is different and Smoil is okay? Or should we go ahead and compare it to Kabbalah Saddam and say, well, maybe Yom Kippur is different, but ordinarily we compare Kabbalah to halacha just as Kabbalah needs Yemin, likewise halacha. The Gemara actually figures, well, faced with a choice, whether to draw an analogy from Kabbalah or go ahead and compare it to halacha and Yom Kippur, perhaps halacha and Yom Kippur is a better source to teach us the halacha of halacha. Right? The shayla is, what about halacha's dam? Could it be done with Smoil or not? So you're faced with a choice. Should I go compare it to Kabbalah's dam, which needs Yemin, or should I compare it to halacha? Same context. Halacha Yom Kippur, which Smoil is fine. That's the Gemara's shayla. And in fact, Rav Sheshes responded in kind. Exactly. This var Amalur Rav Sheshes. Then he saw. We have it in the Mishnah. Notas hamachta b'minay. It's like apis Smoilay. He takes hold of the machtan on his right and the kaf on his left. It's pretty clear. When it comes to halacha, smoil is kosher. Asks the Gemara, why couldn't he bring a better raya? A raya from a korban itself. This none. Haregel shall yimin b'smoil. The Mishnah here is describing the Kohanim transporting the ivarim of the korban to the mizbeach. We have the first kohen holding the roish in his right hand, and the regel shall yimin, the right hind leg of the behemoth, b'smoil in his left hand, with the skin of the leg facing outward, and the makam chatach, the actual cut facing inward, so that it's derech covered. In any case, we see that you can do halacha, can transport these ivarim bismile. Wouldn't that be a better raya? Rather than go to Keteris, bring a raya from the zevach itself, from a korban. If only from there have amin, I would say hanamili halacha b'leim akal kapara. That leniency only applies to halachas ivarim, which are not critical components in the kapara procedure. Even if you fail to makter the ivarim, you receive kapara and kapara el bedam. Perhaps halachas ivarim isn't so critical, isn't so vital, and smile is fine. Aval halacha the makal kapara, when it comes to halacha of dam, which is critical and vital to the success of the korban, perhaps law you can't use your left, kamash malon. That's why Sheshes brings the raya from Keteris. Keteris is mechaper lashon hara, and we see it can be done with your left, and that's its conclusion. Before we proceed, let's go back to Rashi, starting with the first wide line, the second wide lines. Asakaf b'smoiloi. So he brings the raya from Keteris. Al maksher b'smoil. Apparently, small is fine by halacha. Why doesn't he bring a raya from the korban itself? Haregel shel min b'smoil. Mi shazach lahalas lekevish. Hareish haregel mikabel miyadam anatechas hareish b'minay. So this fellow who is zeicha to transport the ivarim onto the kevish, he receives the roish from the one that cut up the animal. He receives it in his right. Ves regel yemanis shel tavid mikabel b'smoil. Whereas the regel yemanis he accepts in his left. Ubeis ar lechutz mokim chatach lefnim. The cut side is facing inward, klape koin mechena, as a form of covet. Hanimili, I would say, well, you can't bring it right from there. Hanimili halacha of ivarim, which is not ma'akiv kapara. Halacha say ivarim, says Rashi, loy ma'akiv kapara. Shei kapara al badam. In fact, v'hu atzma shlei huktu revar of karshin. Even if they fail, totally neglect to be makti the ivarim, the korban is still karshin. Ava halacha is dam, the dam ma'akiv kaparu. So it's a vital component of the korban. Perhaps you cannot do halacha of dam with your left. Kamash malon. We have the chiddush. Rav Sheshes brings a raya from Keteris, which was transported in his left. You see, halacha can be done bismar. Meisvei, they asked the shaila of Sheshes. We have a brisa which clearly states otherwise, that halacha needs yamin. Brisa says zar ein ankoin v'oinen, one whose close relative passed away, v'shika u'bal mum. All these fellows may not engage in akrava, whether it's b'kabbalah, u'b'hoilacha, u'b'zrika pas. Wrong people. And wrong position as well can create problems. V'chein yosh. If it's a kohen where he's sitting down, not to stand during avodah. Rashi brings a pasuk, lamod l'shos. So if he's sitting, v'chein smoil, or he uses his left hand to perform all these activities. Which ones? Kabbalah, hoilacha, u'zrika pas. Pretty clear that you need your right even for halacha to yufta. This is a refutation of Rav Sheshes. Says the Gemara, you mean to say Rav Sheshes didn't know this halacha? But Rav Sheshes who da'isva, Rav Sheshes himself was the one who presented a challenge from this very brisa in a different context. But he presented this very brisa. How can you say he didn't know the brisa? Where did that happen? The Amalei Rav Sheshes, la'amoyre Rav Chizda. Rav Sheshes turned to the speaker, the interpreter of Rav Chizda, the announcer of Rav Chizda, and he says, do me a favor. Could you ask Rav Chizda the following shaila? Halacha b'zor mahu. May a zor do halacha. So you have the shechita, you have the kabbalah, and now you want to transport the dam to the mizbech. Can a zor get involved in that? So previously we had a shaila regarding halacha b'smar. Now we have a shaila about a zor doing the halacha. Amar Rav Chizda responded, "Kshera, certainly fine. Mikra Masayeni. Actually, I have a raya from a pasuk in Divrei Hayom. Vayishal to a Pesach. vayizruku kehanim miyadam v'alivim mafshita. So the Israelim, presumably the Israelim did the shchita. The kehanim who did the zrika, they accepted the dam miyadam from those individuals, the Israelim, who did the halacha. So it was Yisrael Kain. Yisrael did the shchita. The Kain does Kabbalah. Then he gave it over to the Yisrael who did the halacha. And then the pasuk says, "Vayizruku hakayihanim miyadam." The Kehanim who did the zrika accepted them from the hands of the Israelim who transported, who did halacha. So the pasuk supports Rav Chizda's contention that halacha could be done through a zar. And Rav Sheshes himself presented that very brayso as a challenge to Rav Chizda. The brayso tells us that a zar may not engage in halacha. By the way, why would you say halacha is mutter through a zar? Isn't it one of the 4 avodas of the carbon? First, we ask this kasha. We find that machshavas pigel, for instance, which only applies to the 4 primary avodas. Shechita, Kabbalah, and halacha zrika applies to halacha. It's a vital component. It's part of the procedure. Why would you even entertain the thought that a zar can do it? So in Farshim answer, it's true that in the overall picture of the akrava, within the general context of akrava, the halacha does serve a purpose. It functions as part of the akrava process. And therefore a machshava that occurs during the halacha can affect the entire akrava. It connects to the other phase, the other stages of the akrava. But if you look at it on its own, halacha is merely a transporting act, taking from one place to the other. Not really transforming, not really creating anything. In fact, you could even avoid halacha altogether. Suppose he does shchita right next to the mizbeach. You don't need to actually do halacha. It's just a means of transporting. Therefore, on its own, if you view it on its own, it doesn't really have its own inherent value. Therefore, perhaps it could be done bismile or a zar can do it as well. In any case, that was of Chiz's chiddush that a zar can do halacha. And Rav Sheshes asked the kash. Brayso says zar va'oinin v'shikar va'amum b'kabbalah u'b'halacha u'b'zrika pasal. It's clear that a zar cannot do halacha. V'chein yoshev v'chein smile pasal. So this brayso was used as a kasha and a refutation of Chiz's chiddush. It's pretty clear that Rav Sheshes knew the brayso. He was aware of the information contained in this brayso. So why did Rav Sheshes even present a shaila regarding halacha b'smoil, and he was refuted from a brayso? What do you mean? Rav Sheshes himself was fully aware of that brayso, which clearly contains the halacha that Kabbalah must be done biyamin. Says the Gemara, Basar the Shama. Yeah, after he heard the brayso, after he was challenged from that brayso and refuted, Hadar Usva. Now he knew the brayso and he used it as a challenge against Rav Chizda. Again, the brayso proves to us that even when it comes to halacha, you need a kohen. Says the Gemara, Rav Chizda Karkama. Rav Chizda proved this point from a pasuk, which indicated that the Yisrael would do the halacha. The Avad Maseh Itztaba. Yisrael didn't do the halacha. He was serving in a Itztaba capacity, as a post, meaning the kohen would do the Kabbalah, and for some reason had to leave the scene for a minute, so he used Yisrael as a supporter. He put the dam into the hands of Yisrael, who would just stand in place, immobile, until the kohen came back, retrieved the kli, and the kohen himself walked the dam to the mizbeach. So maskana is that even when it comes to halacha, you need Yad Yamin and you need a kohen. Ask the Ritva, but we have a Mishnah which tells us that the kohen would transport the Ivarim in his left hand. How small kasha by halacha? He says there is different because it's a Ivarim which is not me'akav kapar, and therefore small was kasha. Ask all the Rishonim, what about Yom Kippur? We find no less than 3 times where the kohen gadol would use his left hand for the avodah. One, while delivering the kaf and the machta to the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The machta on his right, kaf on his left. When he went to retrieve the kaf and the machta from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, one in either hand. When he inserted his hands into the kalfi, into the lottery box, he had both hands involved. How is avoid the kasha b'smol? All the Rishonim say the same thing. Obviously, the Torah allowed it and required it. There's no other way to do these things. So the very fact the Torah says, do it in this manner, bring the Ketores and the Machta into Kodesh Kodashim in one swoop. And there's no other practical way of doing it, rather than having one on the right, one on the left. Evidently, the Torah wants him to use his left as well, and so on and so forth regarding the other avodas. I saw a nice pshat. Why was it Dafka on Yom Kippur that we allow the left hand to be used for avodah? So we say that the right and left of a person, the Yad Yamin and Yad Shmoel, represent different expressions of Hashem's relationship with us. Yad Yamin, which is strong and more powerful, denotes chesed, kindness, generosity, whereas the Yad Shmoel, which is the weaker one of the two, that represents harshness, strictness, judgment, gvura, din. So typically the Kabbalah needed the right hand, chesed. But on Yom Kippur, which was the Yom Mechilu Slicha V'Kapara, you see really left, Yamin, judgment, is rooted in right, in chesed. What's the point of din and harshness? It's just to keep us in shape, to keep us in line, to enable us to be zoiche, to make us roi for Hashem's chesed. So really, Shmoel is rooted, ultimately rooted in the chesed. It's to bring about Hashem's chesed. And therefore, Yom Kippur, which is the ultimate day of chesed, of kapara, mechilus slicha kapara, when you didn't do tshuva, there's no need anymore for the left to express itself as harshness and strictness, and relates back to its source. So it's really just another expression of chesed, in which case we allow the avodah to take place, v'yad Shmoel as well. Okay, time for the chazar to the main points of today's daf. We began with a double shaila regarding kmitza, which is meant to be scooped out and then placed into another kli. What if he stuck it onto the side of a kli? What if he stuck it onto the bottom, but the bottom was overturned? We leave it teku. How full is the chafina meant to be? Overfill? Just flat? No, says the Gemara, just a bit topped off. The Gemara to shaila whether the keteris in his hands are considered like they're within a kli sharis, or it's like the tzavar behema, in which case if it spills out on the floor before arriving into kli sharis, it becomes pasul, and we leave it teku. The Gemara concluded that a machshava of pigel can apply even to the chafin. It's considered an avodah. Regarding the time of chasiyas gecholim, can a machshava apply there? We leave it teku. The question is whether machshir mitzvah is like a mitzvah or not. The Gemara concluded, typically, halacha needs yad yamin and a kohen as well. Hatzlacha Rabbi.